I think Lyndon Johnson and his advisors have decided quietly to embark on an escalation of U.S. involvement. I think they enter 1965 with that basic position.
At this point, there's also an increasing military pressure from not only the National Liberation Front, but also from the North Vietnamese Army, which is infiltrating through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ultimately, President Johnson decides that they have to intervene militarily, and the decision is made to start with air power.
One early morning in March of 1965, Dr. Quat called me on the phone, "Come to my place right away. There are some important things."
The setbacks, both politically in South Vietnam, where there is continuing political turmoil in Saigon, the increased brazenness and willingness of the Viet Cong to launch attacks, the degree to which American advisors are increasingly vulnerable themselves to being attacked, all of this feeds a growing sense that we're at a crossroads here.
And Dr. Quat said to me that there are 3 Marine battalions from the American landing in Da Nang. I was surprised. How come that it comes so suddenly like that? The military situation, well, of course, is a very dangerous, but how come this very sudden development like that?
I think the lack of communication between not only the White House and the government of South Vietnam, but also the military command and the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff and the U.S. Embassy has a lot to do with a lack of trust. I think ultimately there is a sense that South Vietnam is an ally, but there very much is a senior subordinate relationship there.
With regard to Operation Rolling Thunder, Johnson and the White House wanted to incrementally raise the bombing so at some particular point, rational people would decide that they didn't want to prosecute the war in the South. The only problem is that they did not get to define rationality on the part of North Vietnam. The White House imposed so many restrictions that it really achieved nothing other than putting those air crews at risk.
Operation Rolling Thunder was a mistake because it did not take into account the psychology of the North Vietnamese and the fact that the North Vietnamese communists controlled all information going to their population. So they explained the bombing as an obvious attempt by the U.S. to take over control and act just as the French had acted many years before. And that was all the motivation that was needed to raise thousands and thousands of volunteers to both repair the bombing and to go south.
There were dissenting voices in the American government, there's no question about it, and in Congress. The Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey, says, "I don't think we can win this thing, and I don't think it's necessary for us to win it."
First he started bombing the North, and then when it looked like South Vietnam was going to fall, regardless of his bombing, he began to send troops into South Vietnam. Before this happened, my family thought the communists were going to win, and they and a lot of people in the middle class in Saigon were thinking of fleeing again. When LBJ sent troops in, it's like, they saved us at the last moment. The middle class in Saigon was very, very happy.
I think it's worth saying that as Johnson fully Americanizes the struggle, he is determined to keep that as low visibility as he can.
I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division and certain other forces which will raise our fighting strength from 75,000 to 125,000 men almost immediately.
So he announces a large-scale escalation in a quiet way, if you will. He refuses the urgings of some advisors to call up the reserves, to put the nation fully on a war footing. He's not going to do it.
My father told me, we're so lucky. We're such a small, poor country. We had nothing to offer the United States, and yet it's sending troops, giving us not only resources, but saving us with their own lives. We thought with the Americans coming in, there was no way the communists could win.
The plane lands in Da Nang, the door opens, and this heat rolls in, this incredible heat rolls in, which is a lot hotter than any place I'd been prior to then. You're exiting the plane, and there's a row of troops leaving and a row of troops arriving. And the difference between the way we look coming off and the way these other guys look coming on pretty much underscored that, you didn't really realize what you're getting into, because these guys look very different, right? They look very different. These guys had jungle uniforms, and they'd been out in the bush for, a year, and it showed. You could certainly see that they'd experienced something. Something had changed these guys.
The U.S., they have all kind of, support. That time, they have a very good tank they call the M48. Nothing can hurt that tank. Besides that, they can use a bulldozer. They knock all the bobby trap and mine and everything down and to reduce the casualty. The Vietnamese have a lot of casualty because we don't have that kind of heavy equipment. I believe the Americans are gonna win the war very easily, because that kind of support, that kind of troop, and that kind of power. So I don't know why the war continue. Marvin units, they weren't as well equipped as we were. You'd see these guys with a lot of World War II surplus weapons, still carrying M1s and Thompsons, and just not up to speed.
The military campaign, which ostensibly is trying to defeat the insurgency, is actually having a negative impact on the population because they're blaming the Americans for all the damage that's being wrought on the countryside. So I think that was part of the problem that you saw from a quantitative approach that folks like McNamara and others tried to place on top of a war that was much more about legitimacy and loyalty and relationships.
You can't do it by body count. That's not how you win a war. Right? You win a war by, making the enemy unable to continue, not by killing their people.
You cannot kill your way to victory in an insurgency. You go into a village, even one that's basically sympathetic with the government, and you fire on some American helicopters, and they fire back and kill villagers, and you just converted that village. The Viet Cong very quickly realized this was a great recruiting tool.
Life is turned upside down for us, and even younger like myself, we had to take a part of the war, and we fought against American, against the South Vietnamese, even though it's a lot of dead and wounded in our country. And so for them to stay and fight, that is only choice.
And the military does not build nations, The military kills people. Right? And it destroys things. It blows things up and it kills people.
Americans come in, we have to run and hide in a bunker. We try to be friendly, but when we're shaking, we're so scared and run around, somebody else die. For Americans, see, Viet Cong is an enemy, it's an evil. To us, they're the Vietnamese. They are people. They are the villagers.
That tension between trying to build a South Vietnamese political community, or assist with that, and at the same time fight a war that was causing depopulation, that was causing great tragedy across the South Vietnamese landscape, that helped undermine what was a very comprehensive strategy. And all that had to be taken into account as you're trying to maintain support not only from the American home front, but also from the South Vietnamese home front, and also demonstrate that you're making progress.
The anti-war movement had kind of gone through what I think of as being a period where folks in the movement thought, well, we can just convince our leaders that there's been a mistake, that this was a terrible idea, and if they knew everything we knew, they would realize the errors of their ways. But that wasn't working. It was clear to them that the government knew full well what was happening and that they intended to pursue this war. And so by 1967, the movement took on a more radical turn. This was the period in which folks were trying to, stop the war by any means necessary. It was the year that they tried to levitate the Pentagon. It was the year that the resistance, the draft card burning and the draft resistance got started.
The staging area was usually Lafayette Park across from the White House, and I would, for a large demonstration, generally go out in front with a walkie-talkie and direct attention to particular areas if a large number were massing in a particular area. And of course, the residual fear would be that there would be some storming of the White House itself. It was even suggested at one time that we should electrify the fence, and I thought that was a supremely terrible idea, and it did not go forward. There were chants outside, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today?" And we could hear it. We could hear it in the West Wing, and the president could hear it in the Oval Office. Even when nothing more was happening, it was just present all the time.
In late 67, as Johnson is insisting on good news being presented to the American people, General Westmoreland says, "We have reached an important moment when the end begins to come into view."
The enemy cannot win now in Vietnam.
Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese are planning what becomes known as the Tet Offensive, in which a massive series of attacks throughout South Vietnam, designed to ultimately topple the South Vietnamese government, to cause an uprising on the part of the populace, and to end the war on communist terms.
Lays Juan believed that by simultaneously attacking the cities and towns across South Vietnam with main force units, that it would be powerful enough to inspire the masses to rise up and topple the Saigon regime once and for all. So this was how, Vietnamese communist troops would win in short order. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap did not believe that, this strategy should be implemented at the time in the manner that Lê Duẩn saw fit. They always believed that, Lê Duẩn strategy was always just too risky, and it risked losing all the gains made at that point by the Communist Army. So that was the disagreement in 1967. Lê Duẩn, using the powers of his police state, arrested all of his enemies. All of this was to send a signal, send a sign to Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, who could not be arrested, to sort of quit their opposition to Lê Duẩn decisions and his strategy. Lê Duẩn prevailed.
The North Vietnamese are pretty smart. They launch a preliminary attack at Khe Sanh on January 21st, even while, basically 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong are positioning themselves for what becomes the Tet Offensive.
I went to Khe Sanh in December, right? On the 20th of January is when, all hell broke loose. And they attacked both 861 and the base in full strength with this enormous artillery barrage. Cut the road and basically cut the base off. The actual, quote, siege was about 2 months. I think there were roughly 6,000 Marines at the base, and there were roughly 40,000 NVA surrounding us. They had this enormous advantage in terms of artillery and so forth, and they were just slamming the base every day. The advantage we had that, say for example, the French didn't have at Dien Bien Phu was air power. As the siege went on and the weather got better, right, air power just decimated these guys.
When the communists launched a countrywide attack called the Tet Offensive of 1968, the Americans launched a ferocious counterattack and drove the communists from all the cities and towns they had occupied.
Tet had an enormous psychological effect, more of a psychological effect than a military effect.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion.
Johnson said something to the effect of, if we've lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost the country.
The message of the Tet Offensive to the American administration and to the American people is, yes, unless you continue, not only continue at this level, but unless you sink more into this war, you're not going to win. So there was two different perceptions, really, in Vietnam and in the United States.
March was a very dramatic month. Clark Clifford, when he became Secretary of Defense, was one of the two men who were deeply involved and really led that effort to push the president to reconsider some of these positions. The other was my great friend and colleague Harry McPherson, who was then the chief speechwriter for the president. Clifford was asked to report on his trip to Vietnam. He said, we have three alternatives. One is to extend our troop commitment to roughly 1 million men. No one wanted to do that. The second was to concentrate our troops in highly populated other critical areas. Nobody wanted to do that. And the third is to begin a staged withdrawal. Clifford was doing an adroit lawyer's trick, really, was to put on the table this issue, and he did it in the context of two obviously unattractive options, leaving only withdrawal. Harry wrote at the president's request a hawky speech and a dovish speech. For a while, the president was working with the hawky speech, and then he called and said, now make these additions to speech B, which was the dovish speech, and Harry called Clark Clifford and said, we have prevailed.
Tet represented a defeat for Lyndon Johnson. In the aftermath of Tet, he comes to a decision that, just as he feared, Vietnam has been his undoing. Just as he feared, he is politically defeated in many respects. And he makes the decision that he's not going to run for re-election in 1968.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Nixon was elected in the '68 election, sort of intimating that he had a secret plan to end the war.
The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker.
In fact, he didn't have a secret plan. He had some amorphous ideas about how to withdraw from Vietnam, but he's still involved in the Cold War and can't afford just to, basically, as Kissinger says, to pick up everything and come home. So the idea becomes, how do you disengage in Vietnam and still give South Vietnam a reasonable chance of surviving after you're gone? And the answer was Vietnamization.
As I announced on Tuesday, by December 15th, our troop strength in Vietnam will have been reduced by a minimum of 60,000 men.
That was essentially improve the capacity of the South Vietnamese to defend themselves while withdrawing U.S. troops, and at some particular point, they stand up and we stand down.
When President Nixon came into power, even though he was withdrawing American troops, he was also fighting very hard to weaken the communists. We thought Nixon was a tough candidate. We were reassured by his belligerence.
Hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go. End the war. End the war.
We wanted to end the war. We wanted to bring the American soldiers home. We didn't want to have any more dead American boys.
1969 was a critical time in the anti-war movement. There had just been this very popular, very broad participatory moratorium on October 15th, which had involved 3 million people across the country in all forms of anti-war protest, including what some people described as a general strike. I mean, lots of workplaces had closed down for the day or part of the day. Tens of thousands of students didn't show up. So the moratorium had happened, and on November 15th was an incredibly large anti-war demonstration as well.
I helped organize busloads of people from Pittsburgh and western Pennsylvania and even parts of northern West Virginia.
I sort of ran the stage, and Peter Yarrow ran the music, and it was a marvelous, marvelous turnout.
This was just overwhelming. I mean, I couldn't even imagine, an ocean of people. I remember speakers, I remember music, I remember moving around and marching. I remember a lot of security overhead and helicopters and police presence, especially protecting the White House.
And the word was, end the war in Vietnam now, bring the troops home, and lots of wonderful people came. Coretta Scott King was the co-chair with Bill Coffin, Reverend William Sloane Coffin, and she also participated in the March Against Death the night before, where Americans marching held the names of dead American soldiers.
In November 1969, Richard Nixon made a speech that's come to be known as the Silent Majority Speech. And in it, he made an appeal to what he described as the silent majority of Americans. They were the people who were not out in the streets protesting, who did not have their voices being heard. And he needed their support in order to negotiate successfully with the Vietnamese.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action which will enable me to keep that pledge.
On the one hand, he said, we can have this path towards peace, but on the other hand, we don't want to lose. And in order for that to happen, I need you, the silent majority of Americans. After that speech, a majority who polled saying that they sympathized with Nixon, and only a large but a minority of folks saying that they were kind of with the protesters.
Behind the scenes, I think you see a Nixon that has come to see Vietnam as an example of the limitations of American policy. And when he does articulate what will become known as the Nixon Doctrine, I think that doctrine is in fact an admission that there are limits to American power.
We shall furnish military and economic assistance when requested in accordance with our treaty commitments. But we shall look to the nation directly threatened to assume the primary responsibility of providing the manpower.
And in that sense, it is necessary for the United States to withdraw from Vietnam so Nixon and Kissinger can rethink the structure of the Cold War and relationships not only between the United States and Russia, but also with China, and I think ultimately with the rest of the world.